Hello, welcome to the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. This is episode 19, What Are Important Unbreakable Bonds? I'm Bruce Gemmell. I'm a speculist, researcher in architecture, draftsman, and I guess among other things. Anyway, we've been talking about the nature of an unbreakable bond, or what I would call a proto-metaphor. It kind of started out early on in our discussions because we started with the idea of the organizational capacity of what I call the operation of the metaphor. Now, what we've done is we've gone through several different things to where we're kind of coming back to this idea. Now, let's talk about what we're doing here. These are a series of ruminations that I'm doing once a week, early Sunday morning at 3 o'clock from New York City, and just kind of putting these things together to kind of like conform to my own understanding of my ideas. One of the things I've kind of realized, and I'm going to say in relation to the proto-metaphor, is the reason why I kind of call it a proto-metaphor. I came across this concept in talking about other things, and I came across this idea of what I call unbreakable bonds. I never really thought about it. I just kind of named it that. And I'm kind of like seeing this thing as something that's emerging. Anyway, we talked about the fact really early on that, metaphor is an operation in nature. It actually has its process, and the idea of kind of having things complicate each other, and as a result, uh, be able to inherently entangle in such a way that they can create an unforeseen thing from seen things. Uh, the capacities being there, but not necessarily understanding the potential entanglement that brings forth a new thing from the previous. We talked about the natural world. We talked about in the artistic, literary artistic world. And I think that the proto metaphor is what I would call it in a kind of societal or civilizational context. The interesting thing about the proto metaphor and why it's not an unapt term is the fact that it doesn't really give rise to new concepts. They kind of like don't have, I guess, to put an organic kind of term on it, they don't have a self sustaining capacity as they would do in the organic world or as they would do in the artificial world of art and literature, science, and things like that. And kind of have to ponder that one, but it's interesting. But these couplings do have a value, and we've found these things to kind of have a circumstance in that they have a value. They are constructed, and once constructed, they have an ability to kind of help us understand how to use our genius to create them in terms of moving towards fulfilling our destiny and what we talked about last week in terms of the idea of what Ortega talks about in the Revolt of the Masses, but also can be used as a check of ourselves to see if indeed we are being true uh, to ourselves. So we generate these things in order that we can kind of construct them in order to go deeper and kind of fulfill a deeper purpose as we move from simplicity to complexity. And they can also be used to kind of indicate by the way they're treated, by the way they're maintained, as to how much we still understand and appreciate those capacities. We've gone through a few of those exercises. We talked about that in relationship to criticism. I had an episode where I talked about, an understanding of criticism as an indictment of of societal decay and what I call societal health. And we realized that in our society currently, criticism, which is something that is very, very vital in terms of like the progress, something we'll talk about tonight, towards the relationship between ideas and progress, is pretty much under siege, and that's a dangerous circumstance societally. So we'll kind of think about that. But anyway, so here we are talking about some historically and contemporary unbreakable bonds of significance. So the point was, what are some important unbreakable bonds? We talked a while ago about the idea of what one was, what was an unbreakable bond. We talked about the fact that probably at other times that it existed, but for the current operation that we see, the coupling of, I've gone over this before. I think sometimes by going over these things, we kind of understand and kind of can recapture the structure as we kind of like walk along. We talked about the fact that technique technology had often been linked to different things in order to kind of allow it to kind of move and progress. But what happened was prior to other times in history, a lot of times technology was linked to superstition, to religion, to non rational concepts. So what happened was we looked at that, which we probably see coming around in Western society, rediscovered because it had existed before in the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, I think we understand and appreciate the idea that we started to use reason other than superstition and non-reason to kind of link in the kind of uh, the kind of like relationship of how we would deal with technology. So whereas previously we had belief structures that basically could not be testable in terms of our ideas about how we would make things. And then we had those traditions. And then we realized that we would be able to make much, we had benefits by linking that technology to science and reason, that by being able to test and do experiments and be able to kind of assess the results, we could find things like, say, the ability to kind of understand how to test the strength of steel, and then therefore understand how to make a more efficient and more effective blade. So we realized that how we could make materials to be stronger, faster, uh, smoother. Well, they don't get faster, but then the fact that it was smoother, lighter, and basically afforded opportunities. So we kind of started to link our technique to our science and our reason. So that was the one we started with. So we'll kind of talked about that, but I think that there's one of my favorites. I think this is kind of a primitive one, and this is kind of one that goes back for a long time. Is like under the rubric of genius, if there actually is one that we could say, if there is not maybe not a proto metaphor, but an actual metaphor societally, I think that curiosity and imagination are very well linked in terms of the idea of where we kind of go. I mean, I've always felt as if my curiosity and imagination were things that were separate from me, that I basically just simply nurtured and attended to, that I was their caretaker, their steward, that my curiosity and imagination had a life of their own. And basically it was my privilege to take them around so that they could best manifest themselves in the adventures that they would be able to kind of find for themselves. So let's see. What we're going to talk about is five simple ones. We're going to talk about we're going to talk about the Federal Republic and society, tolerance and strength, social liberty and freedom. We're going to talk about a piece related to Alfred North Whitehead's idea that he talks about in Adventures of Ideas, which is basically ideas and progress. And another one is going to be observation or criticism and discernment and judgment. So these are things that I think are kind of significant or important unbreakable bonds that exist kind of like within our contemporary sphere. The one in relationship to Whitehead basically kind of is pretty much demonstrative in, delineated and illustrated quite well in his 1933 book, Adventures of Ideas. Interestingly enough, I just realized, The Revolt of the Masses, written in 1930, kind of comes out around the same time. And there's echoes between the two. I don't think there was any real relationship between Whitehead and Gasset. I think they basically were, maybe aware of each other. I mean, I know that in History of Ideas, Marius talks about Whitehead as significant and respect. He seemed to be in his delineation of Whitehead in his book History of Philosophy. Marius, who's a student, probably the prime student of, well, not prime student in terms of his own ideas, but prime student in terms of documenting Ortega's ideas. He seems to kind of see a real reverence and understanding the significance of Whitehead, outside of the particular lineage with which Marius writes the History of Philosophy, which kind of pretty much runs through the School of Madrid, which he's a part of. Um, but is very much aware of Whitehead and his significance, which I think Whitehead is probably for me uh, not just the most underappreciated philosopher of the 20th century, but maybe the most important philosopher of the 20th century. And I think it's because since he doesn't come from the philosophical tradition from which most individuals came through philosophy in the 19th century, even though, if you look at philosophy, it's a fairly eccentric um, canon, and it's a fairly eccentric lineage. That you look at the fact that the idea now is that a philosopher is someone who sits at a university as a researcher and writes papers. But when we look at the significant figures in philosophy, they took the role of kind of, say, public intellectuals, in the case of, like, very clearly the case of a successful public intellectual like David Hume, and people like Immanuel Kant, people who never held the university positions, but basically are the cornerstone by which philosophy moved. There were other people who held positions. I mean, Nietzsche held a position as a kind of doctor of philology, but then, kind of never really kind of uh, had that kind of, like, I mean, again, partially it was because he had such a very short life, but I think he was a chair of philology 28 or something like that. But I mean, basically, it was, I think, Birth of Tragedy uh, was kind of trashed, which was his kind of first, again, just a foray into writing, and then it kind of pushed him into a position where he became more into the kind of philosophical. But again, I think just the same way that we tend to think of this as a neat package of individuals who all kind of had a similar trajectory, it's not really the case. I mean, Western philosophy is a collection of ideas, a collection of individuals with people with a collection of ideas of individuals that kind of have a continuity. But it's not as if there was a kind of commonality to the way in which these people found themselves to be of significance. Anyway, so start with the idea of one that's kind of, I'm kind of very uh, um, aware of it, which is this idea of federal republic and society. Now, a lot of people would say that democracy was one of the greatest inventions, or a significant invention, or a valuable invention. I don't think that's a terrible idea. But my country, the United States, is a constitutional federal republic, meaning that we have representative individuals who have a federal republic. That means that the Constitution that we have is the document that we abide by. But the relationship between the federal government and the state governments allows us to mandate the opportunity for different interpretations at different levels. And I think that a lot of times what people misunderstand is we don't want to necessarily have to pass a federal law if it actually is going to be something that is, unless it's something that's absolutely necessary. And I think that judgment in is a very sound judgment, in the fact that America is an incredibly diverse place. And as a result of appreciating that diversity, we don't want to have simply majority rules. So as a result, we have things like the Electoral College, which there's a lot of debate about it. But the reality is, one of the things that led up to some of the revolutions that we saw were the fact that people felt as if the representation was not proper to their needs. And people who live in different parts of this country have different needs to interpret the Constitution in different ways, giving their backgrounds and their needs. And I think that's an absolutely brilliant idea. I think it served us well. And I don't want to mandate from New York City how people in Nebraska should live, nor do I really want them to make that decision for me. They don't understand my circumstance. I don't understand their circumstance. And also, there's certain places where people don't appreciate their circumstance. But at the same time, we need to exist together in order for this nation to be of consequence. And if nothing else, survive. So that's one. Tolerance and strength. One of the great Enlightenment liberal ideas that I kind of feel is very, very fundamental is that of tolerance. But I think tolerance has to have a balance, and there has to be something that allows us to basically withdraw tolerance if we feel as if there's something that we have to concern ourselves with. We want to appreciate and extend and engage in tolerance, because that serves another thing that we're going to talk about next, um, which is, oh, did I write it down? Let's see. No, where did I put it? That's an important one. Oh, okay. Wait a minute. Hold on a second. Society, tolerance, strength, social liberty, and yeah, it comes together. So it's tolerant. Okay, good. So what happens is tolerance has to have a limit, which is basically because the fact is there's no such thing as unconditional tolerance. That's simply submission. So if someone says after they've tied you to a chair, you say, it's okay to tie me to the chair, it really doesn't matter, because at this point you have nothing to stop it if you wanted to. So the reality is there's a strength that's necessary in ability to kind of throw off something that's unwanted. So I think that relationship of tolerance to strength is something that needs to be appreciated and understood. And I think we also understand that in terms of our national security, which is we're willing to tolerate people coming in. We also have to tolerate the people outside. And the reality is people coming here to assimilate to our nation have to understand that both things now have to assimilate to appreciate and respect each other. So, my tolerance is such that I'm willing to welcome you to be able to kind of benefit from the privileges and opportunities that can be afforded an individual here in my nation. However, if you disregard those things that are important, my rule of law, my idea of the federal republican society, my idea of the things like the Constitution, and if you can't abide by these things, then basically there's a certain point where my tolerance has to run out, because I can't say as a group of people that we're willing to basically kind of be submissive to the fact that people are completely, indifferent and intolerant to the things that we hold as important. So since we as a nation support rule under the Constitution, if a group of people was to come into this country, either peacefully or otherwise, and basically say, we want to dislodge the Constitution from America, this would not be something that we would tolerate. So it's the kind of thing where there needs to be that sense of appreciation and respect, because that idea of tolerance has to be matched by strength. And if people don't show the appreciation, we have to have the ability to basically stop that from happening. So, social liberty and freedom, and this is something I think is kind of supremely important. This is something, again, and most of these things that I'm talking about, I would say, have existed within the last 400 or 500 years. Most of these probably within the last 200. In terms of in America in 1776, well, almost 250 years. So I'd say that the idea of ideas in progress is pretty much identified by Whitehead in 1933. But the ideas, predecessors for this had existed before, but he was the one who pretty much put it in perspective. So, the Federal Republican Society, that's something we can kind of go back to the Constitution, the Founding Fathers. Technology and science will take that back to the Renaissance. Tolerance and strength, again, I think that comes from the kind of founding principles. Social liberty and freedom, this again comes out of I'd say, like that Enlightenment tradition of liberalism, which is that social liberty, which is the granting of rights and privileges to individuals, has a benefit in terms that it emancipates a greater operative capacity for freedom. Now, let me explain, first of all, what I mean by those two terms so we understand the difference, because a lot of people use these things interchangeably. They're not synonyms. Liberty is those things society will grant you as an individual in order to kind of have operational capacity. You may vote, you may walk on the street, you may have a job, you may be able to own property. these are social liberties that are afforded to you as a result of the development of the organizational principles of a society. Freedom is an existential concept that is unavoidable and is a basically ontological and epistemological and a cosmological reality. It is a metaphysical undeniability. You are in a situation of freedom in the fact that you have to constantly choose amongst things, choose amongst opportunities, choose amongst circumstances. So, the ability to understand the link between social liberty and freedom was a very valuable thing, that by having this social liberty, individuals can emancipate themselves and be able to have a greater ability to exercise their opportunities within freedom. So I'm not restricting you, or I'm trying not to restrict you, right? So that you can basically kind of find the greater opportunities within the context of the free nature of which you exist. Okay. Now, another one that I'll talk about is ideas in progress, and this is something that basically uh, comes from Whitehead in his Adventures in Ideas. And what he does is he says that we find that certain ideas promote the slow drift of mankind towards civilization. Now, this could be or an organic circumstance. Now, it's an incredibly complex book, incredibly intricate, but the concept is that ideas forged in circumstance basically are those things that the keen individuals can kind of find out to basically promote the slow drift of mankind towards civilization. Now, civilization being a more sophisticated form of organization. So again, we're looking at that same thing we talked about since the very beginning, is that things move from a sense of simplicity through a sense of complexity. So this is the same kind of thing. So I think in this case, we do see the fact that the unbreakable bond does operate as a metaphor in the fact that it basically has the ability to move through the coupling and uncoupling and separation and recoupling and creating a map of these kind of metaphorical or proto-metaphorical or societal bonds to kind of creating a progress, so that we, as we move from a simpler to a complex society, we start to see some of these manifestations, and we can chart it through ideas. And some of the ideas are the things like we said, between criticism and judgment, imagination and curiosity and imagination. So in that case, one of the things that happens is Whitehead identifies certain criteria as the human soul, the humanitarian ideal, aspects of freedom, and from force to persuasion in what he calls the sociological aspect of the adventures of ideas. And these things take them their they take their lead from the ideas of Western society, from Plato and Aristotle through Hume. I mean, the people who kind of are noted are usually the kind of like the people from which we would pretty much be associated with. In this case, I mean, Whitehead leans heavily on Plato, on Aristotle, and on Hume. And I think a lot of times his skepticism, it's not as if Whitehead is just a skeptic in the way that Hume is. There's a lot of rigor, there's a lot of technology, there's a lot of intricacy, scientific intricacy that's understood in Whitehead because of his background that Hume didn't have, but he still maintains that skeptical nature. He still maintains that skeptical nucleus. And by skepticism, I mean the project of skepticism as laid out in the work of the Treatise on Human Nature by Hume and further adventures in ideas and subsequent texts. Not this idea of like just the kind of like the very kind of like household term of skepticism. It's like, I'm just very skeptical. It's the idea of the fact that there is nothing that is ultimately objective or discernible, which is something completely different. The skepticism is skepticism of specific things. It's skepticism of a kind of complete comprehension of truth, of the ability to have, say, a complete objective uh, understanding of anything. I mean, Hume begins from what he calls the passions. And I think as a result, we kind of have a tendency to kind of like forget that. And we kind of say, as if like in that kind of Star Trek idea, it's like, oh, the Vulcans basically came over and they were managed to kind of quell their primitive selves because they discovered logic. Logic doesn't replace the passions, it simply manages them. And it can manage them value in a valuable way or not. But you don't your passions, your desires don't rise from logic and math and science. They benefit from the management and tempering of these things, which is something that I think is a subtlety that we often miss. So, in that regard, I think we need to kind of like appreciate that. Uh, and I think we'll be talking in a couple of weeks about the idea of persuasion. And I think that's something that, again, comes from Whitehead in that sociological aspect. But to return to the idea of the unbreakable bonds, the concept is the fact that these things, by linking themselves, become a great, as we said last week, they're a kind of societal generation that creates an opportunity to construct them in order to move deeper. And each generation basically has their own. I mean, one could probably do a kind of a map of what these things are, but I mean, there are grand ones, there are small ones, and you could probably do that kind of. You could do it with probably any culture. You could probably link those things to kind of see how there's a demise of certain cultures or is there kind of societal health or whatever. You could also use it as a diagnostic. I mean, one of the things that I think is important, uh, thing that Whitehead talks about in Adventures Ideas is that great ideas enter into reality with evil associates and with disgusting alliances. And the ultimate ideals of which they profess themselves the guardians are a standing criticism of current practices, which again takes us back also to Voltaire, Diderot, and that skepticism of a different kind of skepticism, a skepticism of it can all be lost, that this sophistication that becomes lace and finery and salad forks and things like that is at the same time something that can be erased very, very quickly and become chaos. And I think that's something that we also need to be cognizant of. While I have it here, let me kind of pull this out because I thought this was an important aspect of a kind of an understanding that was identified in the Adventures Ideas. This is kind of from the humanitarian ideal, which is one of the first ideals in the kind of sociological kind of portion of the book, which is part one of the three parts. And he said, unfortunately, the Malthusian doctrine, in its popular rendering, affirmed that as a law of nature, the masses of mankind could never emerge into a high state of well-being. Still worse, biological science drew the conclusion that the destruction of individuals was the very means by which advance was made to higher types of species. This was famous doctrine of natural selection, promulgated in 1989 by Charles Darwin. The exclusive reliance upon natural selection was not characteristic of Darwin's own theory. For him, it was one agency among many others. But in the form in which the doctrine reigned in thought from the day of this, natural selection was the sole factor to be seriously considered. As applies to human society, this theory is a challenge to the whole humanitarian movement. The contrast between the dominant theories of Lamarck and Darwin made all the difference. Instead of dwelling on the brotherhood of man, we are now direct to procure the extermination of the unfit. It's powerful and terrifying. We're still kind of like afraid of that. We're still trying to deal with that, right? The idea of the unfit. The unfit is a terrifying thing to think about, that person who's at the edge of the herd. The unsuccessful person, what does that mean? The unfit individual, the unfit. So how does that resolve us when we kind of talk about social liberty and freedom? It's a paradox. Or is it a balance, right? I mean, this book, The Adventures of Ideas, is one of the most amazing, fun, interesting works. I find certain writers exciting to read. I find Voltaire exciting to read. I find Diderot exciting to read, because you never know what they're going to say. But what they're going to say could shock you, but not shock you by just saying something grotesque or whatever, but to kind of give you a kind of sense of the incredible paradoxical circumstance by which we manifest ourselves in society. It's a constant wake up call, a constant call to be vigilant against your arrogance, against your ignorance, against all those things that can manifest against your persistence. It's a brilliant book, and I kind of like, it's like, it's not a question of reading certain books. At a certain point, you stop reading them because you've read every page, because you've usually done that cover to cover initial book read, but then you go back because you remember, oh wait, I need to recall this. Oh, what was said? So I don't read The Adventures of Ideas or The Origin of Species or Treatise on Human Nature, or these are books that I basically, kind of, I'm looking at every day, just like I'm looking at my huge, beautiful monographs and manuscripts that I have from Leonardo, who's my master. Because I mentioned the fact that also, I mean, my desire, my love, my passion is architecture. I mean, someone asked me, it's like, if you had done something other than what you do as an architect, was there another thing you would have done? It's a complex question, but I mean, to me, it's like, if I had not had the desire to make things with my hands, to draw and to build, my models and make my configurations, I probably would have just simply existed in the realm of ideas and tried to create things, maybe in mathematics or philosophy. But I just felt the tangibility of drawing, and drawing in the sense of mechanism as it was defined in Leonardo, that kind of made it so satisfying that it was hard to kind of to move away. And I don't know if I could ever move away from that. I mean, I just love to draw. I love the idea of kind of discovery. Was drawing tonight again at the Met, and I kind of picked a very challenging subject. There are some, in the British wing, there are some beautiful 19th century kind of rethinkings and retoolings of Venetian glass techniques. And there's this case, which I think has like 7 beautiful glass objects in them. And they just have a luminosity that is just magnificent. It's just, and I thought to myself, I can't draw that. I just don't have the hand for it. I don't know anyone. I'm not sure I know anyone who does. But I thought to myself, I have to do it. And in the process of doing it over the course of this last 3 or 4 weeks, on my Friday and Saturday, kind of like adventures to the Met, I can't say it's been an ultimate success, but I have to say that there has been moments where I've been able to kind of find my way at challenging crossroad moments and be able to continue to forge forward. So I'm happy about that, because one of the things that kind of, as I've moved out of just, the characterizations of kind of figures from busts, I found that in the still life objects, which I think are more the kind of perfect architectural companion, the glass and crystal objects have kind of presented, incredibly intricate challenges for great exercises. So Now, to finish off here, let's talk about the idea that we've talked about before, which is criticism and discernment. So, criticism is something that I think is, again, probably the most direct expression of technology and science. In order to have that correlation between technique and reason, or technology and science, between operation and experimentation, there needs to be this exchange between observation and discernment, that we kind of look at the fact that how do we uh, get to this point where we kind of understand how these two things correlate. I look at a circumstance and I say to myself, I believe what I'm looking at as is this. Now, that is my intention, honestly or otherwise, to basically generate some information to be passed along in terms of the potential for deepening our understanding of this piece that's uh, under scrutiny. Now, without the ability to understand and discern what it is that I'm saying, we can't assess its value. So the point is, the idea is not a tyrannical kind of state where I just pronounce. The pronouncement, the authority of the pronouncement comes through the consequent evaluation of value, if any exists. So I think that again is incredibly important, unbreakable bond. Where that comes from specifically, I think it's basically a kind of dialogue that kind of we can trace back to the Greeks. Certainly, it's something that the ability to make observations and then discern their consequence of their value. I mean, I can see in kind of like, Parmenides or Heraclitus, and this idea of kind of like having the ability to assess the value of statements as having consequence. Again, this goes back to the idea of the fact that though I don't do something with an objective for universality, I do it for a sense of utility for myself. But if that utility can be of a universal value, it probably can carry some great societal significance. One of the things that I think we kind of like overestimate or underestimate is just exactly what is significant to us. And that's, I think, part of the issue. One of the things that I think that we have to kind of assess is that one of the great societal kind of like indicators is value. And I say it all the time. I use them almost synonymous where I talk about consequence and value and talk about value. And I think we as a society um, need to kind of check that as an indicator of societal health. So that's something I'm kind of like going to try to look at, because what we have coming up is the importance of unbreakable bonds for tonight. No, what are important unbreakable bonds? And next week we're going to talk about the importance of unbreakable bonds, and then on the 20th of April we're going to talk about force, power, rule, and persuasion, which is, again, like I said, part of something that kind of leads from this. Then after that we have tradition and culture, which is a bit of a throwback, but it leads into some other things, because we're going to talk about other things that I feel are important in terms of this idea of what's at the heart of any artistic, speculative, and adventure, which is the idea of love, beauty, and truth. And then I'll go in separately: truth, beauty, and love. These are also kind of in the third part of 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 Whitehead's Adventures of Ideas. And it's funny because, I mean, I cannot say, I mean, let's say, I'm not going to say I've read extensively, like I'd say an individual who kind of like has studied philosophy in the classical sense. I mean, I remember when I read the History of Philosophy by Marius. He talked about the fact that in order to, the reason why the book was written was to get I think that to get through your course of philosophy in the School of Madrid, there was a comprehensive exam, I think, given partially through your kind of your tenure at school, where you had to pretty much be tested on the entirety of the history of philosophy. I can't say I've read that to the point where this was so any student who basically had to go through this exam had to go through this this ability to read everything that had ever been written. And it was heartening to me to know that there were people who cared that much to do that, and that Marias took it upon himself to make a course. And it was like it started as an impromptu course that he administered to a group of girls who had seen the need for such a course. One of the women within that course eventually became his wife. So it's a kind of beautiful story. But I find that I cannot say that I have that kind of encyclopedic knowledge. When I look at people like Martha Nussbaum, who I consider like the maybe the only true living philosopher today, I kind of think of the fact that when I read her books, I get the sense that this is a woman who at least has put eyes on every single text that had existed in in the classics and antiquity, and that not only was she able to kind of set eyes upon these things because she felt the necessity, she absorbed so much, and so many subtle and gentle and beautiful ideas kind of came with that. I hope one day I have the privilege to kind of get a chance to speak to her. I mean, I've had the privilege to speak to some other people within what I would call the realm of philosophy. I'm not going to mention their names, but um, I love listening to her. I think that she's one of the most uh, elegant, sophisticated thinkers that I've ever read. I think she's very vastly underappreciated, but like I said, I believe that she really is the only living philosopher of our day, Martha Nussbaum. But again, I think it comes from that understanding of the fact that it's necessary to know every single line of every single page, and kind of understand every possible nuance to be able to kind of make your formulations with that kind of grace and elegance and sophistication. Anyway, so that I think gives us a sense of what are important unbreakable bonds. And the next week, it'll basically be the importance of unbreakable bonds. Well, we've kind of already alluded to that. I'm just going to go in more in depth. But basically, the importance is that society generates those opportunities for us to generate these things in order to kind of understand and appreciate and kind of capture our destiny or fall below it. And also, once formulated, they can be used as a test to kind of indicate our societal health. And we've done that exercise here in terms of some of the things that we've spoken about. Okay, so then after that, we'll talk about some other things, but I think that basically gives us a sense of the kind of purposefulness, the value, and the consequence of the unbreakable bond. So this has been good. This is again, I kind of always figure like, oh, this will be a 15-minute talk, and it turns out to be 45 minutes or an hour. I have never gone over an hour, so I'm really fortunate about that. But again, I keep trying to kind of, that's why I keep breaking them up. But it turns out it's hard to kind of get them in kind of less time. But this one, I mean, not terrible. I mean, it's under 45 minutes, which for me is almost a miracle. So anyway, let's kind of like wrap up for now. So as we say every week, and this also is something that's kind of becoming more and more important, is like, during COVID, a lot of people kind of said, stay safe, stay safe. And I kind of started to see the kind of creeping authoritarianism in that phrase. And I started to kind of get to sounds like, safe. What do we mean by safe? I mean, are we basically deciding for me what my safety is? And are you basically saying like, well, we need you in order for you to be safe, we need to impose these rules again on you against your will? And I'm like, well, do I need this safety? Yes, you do. So I kind of felt that it was important to kind of stay free, right? Now, again, we also are all, as we said, that freedom is basically a kind of like existential thing that we can't escape. But the point is to stay free in order to enable yourself to, to kind of engage in those opportunities that your freedom entails for you. So that's why I think the more and more I think about it, this is becoming almost a kind of like a, subversive statement when we say that the realm of ideas is free to all and it's to the benefit of all. And I do believe that for us to maintain this. So thank you. And we'll look to see you soon.